Now, before we were taking the break, we started talking about how there were all kinds of indications of voter fraud, and this is both retail and wholesale. And I want to get to the wholesale because we got some really interesting stuff to cover with you on the wholesale aspect of it. And that's like the voting machines. And we want to try to get to that. We're fast running out of time on the show. And I don't know if we're going to be able to get to all of it, but I'm going to try to cover some of it for you. But before we get there, you have to think about all the retail fraud that we saw in this election with the mail-in voting. I mean, we saw the wrong people voting, dead people voting twice or more, including in states where they didn't live. I mean, this is endemic to the concept of just wholesale mailing out ballots to everybody, not even having the correct addresses where these people might live. And then you receive the ballots back. And who knows who voted those ballots, right? Because remember, they turned off the signature match verification, or they turned it down so low that any kind of a written signature is going to pass the match verification. That's what they did in Las Vegas. Anything at all, any scribble would pass. And in many states like Georgia, they wouldn't even examine the signatures to see if they matched the signature on record for that particular voter. So if you got somebody's ballot to your house, there was apparently no real risk in just filling it out, scribbling something in the signature, and mailing it back. Heck, your ballot may have even gotten counted on their behalf as their vote. And we have stories of people showing up to vote and being told, sorry, you already voted by mail-in ballot. We had stories of ballots being added, physical ballots being moved in en masse in places like Detroit and other places. There's a story out of Georgia with pristine ballots being counted, supposed mail-in ballots that had never been folded. Well, anybody that's ever done a mail-in ballot, like many of us here in Florida have done, you got to fold it up to go in the envelope. Well, here's a pristine stack of ballots that never got folded. You had in Detroit and Philadelphia and other places, poll observers were being kept out, watchers were being kept out. Now, why would you want to keep somebody out? This happens every election. You have poll watchers. And now not only are they being kept out, but then the Supreme Court, like in Pennsylvania, is coming in and saying, hey, it's fine to put them 100 feet away from where the actual counting is going on because they still get to observe it, albeit from, quarter of a mile away. That's an observation. That under the definition of observation, that counts. Well, here would be my suggestion. Why are we doing it different than how we always do it? You always have these poll observers and poll watchers who can stand up close and actually watch the count being done and catch and check things. That's the whole purpose of them. But this election had to be different. And if there was nothing to hide, why did they have to close these people out? How about the vote counting stopping in the middle of the night? Remember that? I mean, it just stopped. Everybody went home. I've never heard of that before. Nobody's ever heard of that before. We always count to the end. Remember the water main breaking in I think it was Gwinnett County and right near Atlanta? Everybody had to go home. The water main broke. Well, guess what? They've done public records requests on that. No water main broke. There was just a very mild leak, and it was nowhere near any of the voting equipment. This is coming from the only public records that were returned were some text messages between somebody and the head of facilities there. And that guy said, hey, this has been blown way out of proportion. There was no break. There was no emergency. It wasn't near any of the voting equipment. Essentially, it's a made-up story. But has the mainstream media come back and corrected any of that? No, they haven't. We've got stories of people being offered incentives to vote. We got stories of people harvesting ballots or voting for other people in nursing homes, mental hospitals, even large groups of homeless people. People have been indicted for this stuff. And then you've got, of course, the statistics that look so suspicious. There's one, we'll try to run through a few specifics here, and then I think I want to turn into the voting machines, and that will flow through our Out There. We'll replace some of the Hunter Biden stuff we were going to do in the Out There with covering some of these voting machines issues. There's been so much fraud in this election. I mean, even the Federal Election Commission chairman, Trey Traynor, has confirmed that this election was absolutely rife with fraud. I mean, and that's a pretty serious statement. I mean, he's the guy in charge of it. Let's hear from him specifically.
But do you believe there is voter fraud out there, specifically in Pennsylvania and other states that are weighing heavily in on this election?
I do believe that there's voter fraud taking place in these places. Otherwise, they would allow the observers to go in. When you have claims of, 10,000 people who don't live in the state of Nevada, having voted in Nevada. You have the video showing where people are, they're either duplicating a spoiled ballot right there, or they're in the process of just marking a ballot that came in blank for a voter. That's a process that needs to be observed by election observers. State law allows those observers to be in there, and if they're not, then the law is not being followed, making this an illegitimate election.
All right.
I mean, think about that. That's the guy that's the head of the Federal Election Commission. He's saying there's fraud. He's saying there's major issues all over the place, and he just pointed out a couple of them in that particular interview. Now, what's so interesting is that, 70% of Republicans believe that it is somewhat or highly likely that this election was stolen from Donald Trump. The more interesting number, I think, is that 30% of Democrats believe that it is either somewhat or highly likely that this election was stolen from Donald Trump. People can use their common sense. They can see it with their two eyes, despite all the efforts of the mainstream media to program us, to tell you there's nothing to see here, nothing happened, this is just the will of the people. Despite all those efforts, people can see this with their own two eyes, and they can understand something fishy is going on here.
Could you say this was a coup?
You could say that. I mean, these are characterizations, right? You can characterize this in terms of a coup, an attempt to unseat a duly elected leader or leadership structure of a country. And that is just one characterization of it. I mean, what happens, I think, is that people get a little bogged down in some of the language. And some people say, well, you can't say that. You can't say treason. You can't say coup. You can't say this. That sounds too out there for a lot of people. And that's too bad, because what we're talking about just at the basic level is that this election was not sound. The will of the people is not being done. Whatever you want to end up calling it, there's issues with this, and why don't we want this looked into? Those of us who voted, which is a lot of people did vote in this election. Why wouldn't we want our votes to count just the way they're supposed to? One person, one vote, right? Now, if you've got all these other people, these non-entities, people voting twice, people who aren't even being given a ballot, but somebody else is voting their ballot, et cetera, your vote isn't counting because it's being outweighed by the fake votes. There was a lady in Michigan, a civil servant. She's a career civil servant named Jessie Jacob, and she signed in an affidavit saying that she personally witnessed and in some instances was actually instructed to backdate thousands of absentee ballots the day after the election to make it appear as though they had legally arrived in time to be counted with the election. And this is very similar to the story that we heard out of Project Veritas, where they had the postal worker in Michigan who reported the same kind of thing, that they actually backdated the postmarks on a lot of these envelopes by orders coming down from their superiors. And he was willing to swear to that. And these people are putting a lot on the line when they're willing to speak up on this. But her sworn statement says that she estimates that this was done to thousands of ballots, and that she witnessed, in addition to that, witnessed Detroit poll workers skipping voter ID checks. And in fact, she swears to the fact that she was instructed by her supervisor to adjust the mailing date of the absentee ballot packages. So we've got multiple examples of this. She also says that there were 70 to 80 other poll workers who also were instructed to falsify ballots. Now, if she saw thousands, you multiply that by 70 to 80 other poll workers, you're talking about tens or maybe even hundreds of thousands of votes that were illegally counted. And this is a very important city. It's one of the few that, Joe Biden ran away with. Detroit, Philadelphia, Atlanta, there's only a few of these, Milwaukee, where they won the election. Everywhere else was Trump country, except for these few where it was really an outsized turnout for Joe Biden, and it ended up flipping the very states. Another story out of Michigan, nearly three-quarters, I almost said two-thirds, but it's even more than that, nearly three-quarters of Detroit's precincts, that's Wayne County, had mismatched voting totals. And that means, this comes from one of the Board of Canvassing members, a guy named William Hartman, who signed a sworn declaration saying that in his review of the results, he determined that approximately 71% of Detroit's 134 absentee voter counting boards were left unbalanced. Unbalanced, which means they had more votes cast than people registered to cast votes. Now, that just means there's something fishy. There's something fishy going on. Those numbers should balance exactly.
If it works this time, who's to say this isn't going to be the new lay of the land in the future?
Yeah, you're right, Pat George. If it works this time, they'll get away with it forever. Like we told you a minute earlier, there was a story out of Georgia where somebody swore in an affidavit as they were observing the supposed audit that occurred in Georgia, which wasn't actually an audit. You're talking about a razor-thin election in Georgia. I mean, 10 to 12,000 votes, very, very thin margin. That they saw an entire stack of pristine ballots that were uniformly cast. That means all of them were cast for Biden. These are the ballots that weren't folded because they were never put in an envelope. They were probably run off on somebody's printer, and they were run through the counter. There were no markings on the ballots to show where they'd come from or where they'd been processed, and the markings were unusually uniform according to the affidavits. You remember that other story out of Georgia where they found something like 6,000 uncounted votes on flash drives in 3 different counties? I mean, these stories go on and on and on, and I'm only through about half of the specific stories that I was going to call to your attention for retail fraud. How about the 160,000 ballots in Nevada that were thrown out for a local election but kept to elect Joe Biden? Thank you for listening to the Morgan Streetman Show. We hope you enjoyed what you heard, and if you did, please click like and subscribe to help us out. And remember that we recommend that you exercise your brain at least once a week.